The village of Whispering Pines had stood for 3 generations at the edge of the forbidden forest, a settlement built on fear and carefully maintained distance. It was a place of wooden palisades and locked gates, where children were taught from birth that the forest beyond was cursed, that the wolves who dwelled in its depths were not mere animals but creatures of nightmare and vengeance. Though the great wars between humans and werewolves had ended decades ago, replaced by an uneasy truce marked more by mutual avoidance than any real peace, the people of Whispering Pines remained vigilant, their lives shaped by the invisible boundary between civilization and wilderness. In the heart of that forbidden forest, where ancient pines grew so thick their branches wove a canopy that blocked out the sun even at midday, there were places where the very air seemed to hold its breath. Clearings where the ground was perpetually cold, where frost clung to fallen leaves even in summer, where the silence was so complete it felt like a living thing. It was in one such clearing far from any human path, that a wolf lay dying. The wolf was a magnificent creature, even in his broken state. His fur was pure white, the color of fresh snow under moonlight, though now it was matted with dried blood and streaked with ash. He was enormous, far larger than any natural wolf, nearly the size of a draft horse, with paws that could crush bone and jaws that had once commanded armies. Even collapsed on his side, breath coming in shallow, labored gasps, there was something about him that spoke of power, of authority that transcended his current agony. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something more than animal. They were golden, bright as molten amber, and they held an intelligence that was unmistakably, disturbingly human. When the wind shifted and brought the scent of approaching humans, those eyes would open, tracking sounds too distant for human ears, calculating, remembering. The wounds that covered his body told a story of betrayal. Silver-laced blade cuts crisscrossed his flanks and shoulders, the kind of wounds that burned like acid and refused to heal properly. Silver was the only substance that could truly harm a werewolf, and these wounds had been inflicted with precision by those who knew exactly where to strike. Deep gashes ran along his ribs where claws had torn through muscle. Burn marks circled his throat where silver chains had once bound him. This was not the aftermath of a fair fight, but of an assassination attempt. No one in Whispering Pines knew that Maxwell Nightclaw, the legendary alpha king of the northern packs, lay dying less than 2 miles from their homes. To them, the forest was simply a place to avoid, a source of firewood to be gathered quickly and fearfully from its edges. They didn't know that the wolf whose name made other packs bow in submission now lay helpless, poisoned by silver and abandoned by those he had once called brothers. The village elder occasionally spoke of organizing hunts to clear the forest of vermin, but such expeditions never ventured far. For now, the forest kept its secrets and Maxwell languished alone, his strength fading with each passing day. That was until Marion Lonepaw entered his world. Marion was a young woman of 26 who lived in a small cottage on the very outskirts of Whispering Pines, so close to the forest edge that on windy nights, pine branches scraped against her roof. She was an herbalist and healer, a profession she had inherited from her mother before illness had claimed her 3 years prior. Since then, Marion had lived alone, her only companions the dried plants hanging from her rafters and the occasional villager desperate enough for her remedies to overlook their suspicion of anyone who chose to live so close to the cursed woods. It was a lonely existence, and the villagers' wariness of her wasn't entirely without cause. Marion had always been different even as a child. She possessed an uncanny ability to sense suffering, whether in wounded animals or ailing humans, and an almost compulsive need to ease that suffering. Her mother had called it a healer's gift. The village priest had once suggested it might be something darker. Either way, it had left Marion isolated, trusted only when the villagers had no other choice. 2 weeks ago, Marion had ventured into the forbidden forest for the first time in years. She needed moonshade flowers, a rare herb that grew only in the deepest shadows and bloomed for just 3 nights each month. It was essential for treating the fever that had struck the blacksmith's young son, and despite her fear of the cursed woods, Marion's healer's oath compelled her forward. The first time Marion saw Maxwell, she thought she had stumbled upon a death scene. The massive white wolf lay motionless in a clearing scattered with frost-covered leaves, his body so still she was certain she was looking at a corpse. She should have turned back immediately. Should have run to the village and reported the creature's location. But Marion approached instead, drawn by something she couldn't name, her healer's instincts overriding every warning her mother had ever given her about the forest and its inhabitants. It was only when she knelt beside him that she saw the slight rise and fall of his chest, the barely perceptible flutter of breath from his nostrils. He was alive but barely. The silver burns were infected, weeping fluid that should have been clear but was instead dark with poison. His heartbeat, when she pressed her hand to his chest, was irregular and weak. And then his eyes had opened. Marian's breath caught in her throat as those golden eyes fixed on her, ancient and knowing and filled with a pain that seemed to transcend the physical. She expected him to attack, to lash out in fear or fury as any wounded animal would. But he simply looked at her, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he was reading her soul. She should have been terrified. Everything about the moment should have sent her running back to the safety of the village. But what Marian felt looking into those suffering golden eyes wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was the same desperate need that had driven her into the forest in the first place. The compulsion to heal, to ease suffering wherever she found it. She saw not a monster but a being in agony, fighting with every fiber of his existence to remain in this world. "I can help you," she whispered, though she had no idea if the creature could understand human speech. "Please. Let me help you." The wolf's eyes closed slowly, a gesture that seemed almost like permission or perhaps resignation. And in that moment Marian Lone Paw made a choice that would change the course of both their lives forever. She ran back to her cottage and returned with her healer's bag, filled with every remedy she possessed. She worked through the night by the light of the moon, cleaning wounds with water she had purified with silver-removing herbs, applying poultices to draw out the poison, wrapping the worst of the burns with linen bandages soaked in healing tinctures. The wolf never moved, never made a sound, though she knew the treatments must have caused him pain. When dawn broke and Marian finally returned to her cottage, exhausted and covered in blood and forest dirt, she told herself it was a one-time act of mercy. The wolf would either survive or die, and she had done all she could do. But the next night she found herself returning to the clearing with fresh bandages and clean water. And the night after that with better supplies and a clearer plan for treating the silver poisoning. It became a ritual, this nightly journey into the forbidden forest. Marian would finish her day's work in the village, preparing medicines and treating minor ailments, and as darkness fell she would slip into the woods with her bag of supplies. She told herself it was simply her healer's duty, that she would do the same for any creature in such distress. But it was more than that, and Marian knew it. She found herself talking to the wolf as she worked, filling the forest silence with stories of her day, memories of her mother, confessions of her loneliness that she had never spoken aloud to any living soul. The wolf never responded, of course, but those golden eyes followed her every movement with an awareness that seemed far too human for comfort. Marian noticed things. The way the wolf would wait until she was settled beside him before allowing himself to relax, as though her presence brought him some measure of comfort. How he watched her approach each night with what might have been anticipation, his head lifting slightly despite his weakness. The intelligence in his gaze when she explained what she was doing, as though he understood every word. It was in the second week of her nightly visits that Marian did something that went beyond simple healing, something that could have marked her as a traitor to her own kind if anyone discovered. The wolf was slowly recovering from the infections, but he was clearly starving. Whatever had happened to him, wherever he had come from, he had been without proper food for far too long. So Marian began bringing meat from her own meager supplies, the rabbit she had trapped for her own dinner, the dried venison she had been saving for winter. Food that her healer's wages could barely afford to replace. She told herself it was necessary for his recovery, that proper nutrition was as important as any medicine. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. She had begun to care for him, this mysterious white wolf with the golden eyes and the bearing of fallen royalty. She found herself thinking about him during the day, worrying if he was in pain, planning better treatments, wondering about the story behind those terrible silver blade wounds. And at night, as she slept in her cottage, Marian began to dream. They were vivid dreams, more real than any she had ever experienced. In them, a man stood in shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that glowed the same impossible gold as the wolf's. He never spoke, but his presence filled her dreams with a sense of protection, of belonging, of something that felt dangerously like destiny. She would wake with her heart racing, his image burned into her mind, wondering why a stranger's face should feel so intimately familiar. What Marion couldn't know, was that the wolf she was healing in the Forbidden Forest was no ordinary werewolf. He was Maxwell Nightclaw, Alpha King of the Northern Packs, betrayed by his own beta in a coup that should have ended his life. The silver-laced wounds had been meant to kill him slowly, painfully, erasing the most powerful alpha in living memory. And he had been dying, until a human woman with gentle hands and a too compassionate heart had stumbled into his clearing and refused to let death claim him. The bond forming between them was ancient magic, a soul thread that occurred once in 1,000 years, linking two beings so completely that they became halves of a single whole. Maxwell had felt it the first moment her hand touched his chest, a snap of recognition that had given him reason to keep fighting, to keep breathing, to survive long enough to understand what fate had brought to him. But the soul thread was a double-edged blessing. It meant that when danger came for Marion, as Maxwell knew it inevitably would, he would feel her terror as his own. It meant that if she died, a part of him would die with her. And it meant that despite the species barrier, despite centuries of bloodshed between their kinds, despite every logical reason they should remain enemies, they were bound together in a way that transcended such mortal concerns. In the village of Whispering Pines, suspicion was beginning to grow. Marion's nightly disappearances had not gone unnoticed. The village elder, Tobias Greystone, had his eyes on her, watching her with the particular attention he reserved for those he considered potential threats to the community's carefully maintained safety. And in the Forbidden Forest, Maxwell's wounds were healing. Soon he would be strong enough to transform, to stand before his healer in his human form and explain the terrible and wonderful truth of what they had become to each other. The fragile peace between their worlds was about to shatter, and neither Marion nor Maxwell could have predicted the fire that would reshape both their destinies. What had begun as an act of simple mercy, one woman easing the suffering of a dying animal, was about to ignite a transformation that would crown a human as the queen of wolves and prove that sometimes, the most dangerous magic is compassion offered without condition or fear. Before we continue Marion and Maxwell's journey, I need to know, are you part of our pack? If this story has already captured your heart, hit that subscribe button and howl your approval with a like. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Are you listening from the forests of North America, the ancient pines of Europe, or somewhere else entirely? I love knowing where my pack members call home. Now let's return to the Forbidden Forest, where a healer's mercy is about to change two kingdoms forever. The moonshade flowers bloomed only in darkness, their pale petals opening to catch the light of a waning moon. Marion knew this, had learned it from her mother's careful teachings, but knowing didn't make the journey into the Forbidden Forest any less terrifying. The blacksmith's son was burning with fever, his small body shaking with convulsions that no common remedy could touch. She needed the moonshade, and she needed it tonight. The forest swallowed her whole the moment she passed the last marker stone. The darkness here was different, heavier, as though the trees themselves conspired to block out the world beyond. Marion's lantern cast strange, dancing shadows that made her jump at every sound. She walked quickly, following the narrow deer path her mother had shown her years ago, before fear had driven such knowledge from common use. The clearing appeared suddenly, a break in the suffocating press of ancient pines. Frost glittered on the ground despite the mild autumn air, and there, scattered among the fallen leaves, were the moonshade flowers she desperately needed. Marion knelt with relief, pulling her gathering knife from her belt. That's when she saw him. The white wolf lay motionless near the clearing's edge, his massive body collapsed on its side. For a heartbeat, Marion thought he was dead, some magnificent creature claimed by the forest's cruelty. Then she saw the shallow rise of his ribs, the slight mist of breath in the cold air. Her healer's instinct overrode terror. She approached slowly, her hands trembling, and knelt beside him. The wounds were catastrophic. Silver blade cuts crisscrossed his body, the metal's poison turning the flesh around each gash black and weeping. Burns circled his throat like a collar of agony. This wasn't a hunting accident. This was execution interrupted. "Oh, you poor creature," Marion whispered, her voice breaking. "What did they do to you?" His eyes opened then, sudden and startling. Golden eyes that locked onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. In their depths she saw not animal fear but something far more dangerous. Recognition. Understanding. And beneath the pain something that looked almost like hope. Marian's hands moved to her medicine bag, even as her mind screamed warnings. "I'm going to help you," she heard herself say. "Please don't be afraid." The wolf's eyes never left her face, and in that moment Marian Lonepaw sealed both their fates. Marian told herself it was only for one night. She had cleaned the worst of the wounds, applied poultices to draw out the silver poison, and left him with water within reach. By morning he would either survive or he wouldn't. Her duty as a healer was complete. But when darkness fell the next evening, she found her feet carrying her back to the forbidden forest, her bag heavy with fresh supplies. The wolf was awake when she arrived, his golden eyes tracking her approach through the trees. He didn't move, didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply watched as she knelt beside him and began unwrapping the blood-soaked bandages. "The fever's down," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "That's good. The infection is fighting back, but we're winning." She worked in silence for a while, cleaning wounds that should have killed any ordinary creature. But there was nothing ordinary about this wolf. His sheer size defied nature, and those eyes followed her every movement with an awareness that made her skin prickle. "I lost my mother 3 years ago," Marian found herself saying as she prepared a fresh poultice. "Wasting sickness. I tried everything I knew but nothing helped. She told me at the end that some things are beyond our power to heal, that knowing when to let go is as important as knowing when to fight." The wolf's ear twitched, a small movement that might have been coincidence. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe because you can't judge me. Can't tell me I'm weak for living alone at the forest's edge. Can't whisper that I'm strange because I'd rather gather herbs than attend village gatherings." She brought food the third night. Fresh rabbit from her own trap, meat she could barely afford to spare. The wolf waited until she had settled beside him before eating, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he was aware of her watching. By the end of the first week, Marian found herself talking to him about everything. Her childhood memories, her fears, the dreams that left her restless and aching for something she couldn't name. And every night, those golden eyes listened with an intensity that seemed impossible for any animal. It was on the 8th night that Marian realized the truth that terrified her more than any curse or creature. She wasn't coming here out of duty anymore. She was coming because the thought of not seeing him, of not knowing if he was healing or suffering, had become unbearable. She was starting to care for him, and that was more dangerous than any wound silver could inflict. The dreams began on the 9th night. Marian woke gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs, the sheets twisted around her legs. The cottage was dark and silent, but the dream clung to her like morning mist, refusing to fade as dreams usually did. In it, a man had stood in shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair falling past his collar. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she felt his presence like a physical weight, powerful and undeniable. And his eyes. Those eyes glowed gold in the darkness, ancient and knowing, exactly like the wolf's. Marian pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. It was just a dream, nothing more. Her mind was playing tricks, weaving together her nightly visits to the forest with exhaustion and loneliness. By morning she had almost convinced herself of this. But the dream came again the next night and the night after that. Each time the man was clearer. She could see the scars that marked his body, silver white lines across his chest and shoulders that matched the wounds she had been treating in the forest. He never spoke, but she felt his thoughts like whispers against her mind. Protection. Gratitude. Recognition. And beneath it all, something deeper, something that made her wake with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest she couldn't explain. "I keep dreaming about you," she confessed to the wolf on the 12th night, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the healing wounds. "Or someone like you. A man with your eyes. It's foolish, I know. You're a wolf and he's just a phantom my tired mind has conjured." The wolf's gaze intensified, his body going still beneath her hands. For a moment, Marian could have sworn she felt something brush against her thoughts, warm and seeking, like fingers reaching across an impossible distance. He pulled back, startled. "What are you?" she whispered. The wolf didn't move, but those golden eyes held hers with an urgency that made her breath catch. In the dream that night, the man stepped closer to her than he ever had before. Close enough that she could see his face clearly for the first time, see the fierce intelligence and barely restrained power that radiated from him. Close enough that when he reached for her, his hand almost touched her cheek before she woke, gasping his name though she had never heard it spoken. Maxwell, she breathed into the darkness of her cottage, wondering why the name felt like coming home. The wounds were closing but Maxwell was still dying. Marion could see it in the tremors that shook his body when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his breathing would suddenly become labored, as though his lungs were fighting against poison from within. The silver had embedded itself too deeply in his blood, and no amount of surface treatment could reach it. "White sage," she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. He had allowed her to touch him now, had even leaned into her hand the previous night when she stroked his head. "It grows in the deepest part of the forest, near the old stone circle. My mother used it once to treat a child who had swallowed mercury. If anything can pull the silver from your blood, it's that." The wolf's eyes fixed on hers and she felt that strange brush against her thoughts again, stronger now. Fear. Warning. Protection. "I have to go," she said softly. "You'll die if I don't." She left at dawn when the forest was still thick with mist. The path to the stone circle was overgrown, barely visible, leading her deeper into territory she had been warned against her entire life. The trees here were older, their trunks wider than houses, their roots breaking through the earth like the bones of sleeping giants. Marion found the sage growing in the shadow of the ancient stones, its silvery leaves almost glowing in the dim light. She was gathering the precious herb when she heard the growls. 3 wolves emerged from the trees, smaller than Maxwell but still massive, their fur dark as pitch and their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. They moved to surround her, lips pulled back to reveal fangs that could tear her apart in seconds. Marion's hand went to her gathering knife, knowing it was useless. Her heart hammered as the largest wolf stalked closer, its growl deepening to a snarl. Then the white wolf was there. Maxwell moved like lightning despite his injuries, placing himself between Marion and the dark wolves. He was still weak, still trembling, but he stood tall, his hackles raised, a sound emerging from his chest that made the earth itself seem to shudder. It wasn't just a growl. It was a command ancient and absolute. The dark wolves froze. Recognition flashed in their eyes, followed immediately by terror. They dropped to their bellies, whimpering, then fled into the forest as though death itself pursued them. Maxwell turned to Marion, and in his golden eyes she saw the truth she had been too frightened to acknowledge. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a king. Tobias Greystone had been watching Marion Lonepaw for 2 weeks. The village elder was a man who prided himself on vigilance, on protecting Whispering Pines from threats both obvious and hidden. When Marion began disappearing into the forest each night, he had taken notice. When she returned in the small hours with dirt beneath her fingernails and blood on her skirts, he had begun to follow. Tonight he brought witnesses. Marion knelt beside Maxwell in the clearing, administering the white sage tincture that would finally purge the silver from his blood. She was so focused on her work, so relieved that he was improving, that she didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "Seize her," Tobias commanded. 4 men emerged from the trees, their faces grim with righteous fury. Marion lurched to her feet, but rough hands grabbed her arms, yanking her away from Maxwell. The wolf surged upward with a snarl that shook the air, but he was still too weak, still too poisoned to do more than stagger before collapsing back to the ground. "No!" Marion screamed, fighting against the men who held her. "He's hurt. He needs..." "Silence!" Tobias's voice cracked like a whip. He approached Maxwell with a silver-tipped spear and Marion felt her heart stop. "So this is what you've been doing, girl. Consorting with beast. Feeding our enemy. Betraying your own kind." "He's not our enemy. He's dying and I'm a healer, I couldn't just..." "You've been bewitched." Tobias turned to her, his eyes cold with certainty. "The wolves have gotten into your mind, corrupted you with their dark magic. There's only one cure for such corruption." Terror flooded through Marion as she understood his meaning. "Elder Greystone, please, I haven't been..." "Take her to the village square," Tobias ordered. "Lock her in the holding cell. At dawn we cleanse her by fire as our laws demand. Let her serve as an example to any who might be tempted to follow her path." Marion twisted in her captor's grip, her eyes finding Maxwell's. The wolf was trying to rise, his body trembling with effort, those golden eyes blazing with something that looked like desperation. She felt a surge of emotion crash through her, not her own feelings but his rage, fear, and beneath it all, a promise. I'm sorry, she whispered as they dragged her away. I'm so sorry. Behind her, in the clearing, Maxwell threw back his head and released a howl that echoed through the forest like a king calling his army to war. But no army came, and Marion disappeared into the darkness, destined to burn with the morning sun. Marion sat in the darkness of the holding cell, her wrists bound with iron, and waited for dawn. The village square was silent except for the sound of men building her pyre. She could hear the thud of wood being stacked, the rasp of kindling being arranged. They were thorough, these men who had known her all her life. They wanted to ensure the fire would burn hot and fast. She wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified her was knowing that Maxwell was still out there, still weak, still vulnerable. Tobias would send hunters at first light to finish what the rival pack had started. Everything she had done, all those nights of healing and hope, would be for nothing. That's when the pain hit her. It wasn't her pain. It came through the soul thread like lightning, searing and absolute. Marion gasped, doubling over as agony that wasn't hers flooded her senses. She felt bones breaking, reforming, felt muscles tearing and knitting back together in patterns that defied nature. Felt silver burning away like morning frost under an inferno sun. No, she whispered, understanding instantly what he was doing. Maxwell, no, you're too weak. But he was already past the point of stopping. The transformation hit him like a war, his body fighting itself, the silver poisoning resisting every inch of change. Maxwell forced it anyway, dragging his human form from the depths of his wolf soul through sheer impossible will. The soul thread between them blazed white-hot, feeding him strength he shouldn't have possessed, burning away the last traces of silver in his blood. The village guards posted outside Marion's cell never saw him coming. One moment they were laughing, placing bets on how long she would scream. The next they were on the ground, unconscious, and he was there. Maxwell Nightclaw stood before her cell in his human form for the first time, and Marion forgot how to breathe. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall, his body a landscape of scars and hard-earned muscle. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, framing a face that was beautiful and terrible at once, all sharp angles and fierce authority. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. Those same golden eyes, now burning in a human face, fixed on her with an intensity that made her soul ache. "Marion," he said, and his voice was midnight and thunder and coming home all at once. He tore the cell door from its hinges like it was made of paper. "We're leaving. Now." They ran through the forest as the village bells began to toll behind them, announcing Marion's escape and summoning the hunters. Maxwell moved like shadow-given form, pulling Marion through paths she had never seen, his hand wrapped around hers with a gentleness that contradicted his raw power. He had torn a cloak from one of the unconscious guards, wrapping it around his waist, but his chest remained bare, revealing the silver-white scars that matched the wounds she had spent 2 weeks healing. "How far?" Marion gasped as they paused beside a rushing stream. "The border of my territory is another 2 hours north," Maxwell said, kneeling to scoop water into his hands. "Once we cross it, they won't follow. They're not that foolish." "Your territory." Marion stared at him, really seeing him for the first time since the cell. "You said your name is Maxwell." "Maxwell Nightclaw." He stood, and even in the darkness she could see the weight those names carried. "Alpha King of the Northern Packs. Or I was, before my beta decided he wanted my throne more than his honor." "Silas Blackmane," Marion whispered, the name coming to her through the soul thread. Maxwell's eyes flashed gold. "Yes. You feel it now, don't you? The connection between us. I felt it for days. The dreams, the thoughts that weren't mine, the way I knew you were more than just a wolf." She wrapped her arms around herself. "What is it? What's happening to us?" "It's called a soul thread." Maxwell moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the way her dreams had been, but real now, solid and undeniable. "It's ancient magic, rare beyond measure. It binds 2 souls so completely they become halves of a whole. Mates in every sense that matters." Marion's breath caught. "Mates. But I'm human and you're the most powerful alpha in living memory." "I know." His voice softened. "The soul thread doesn't care about such things. It chooses who it chooses, and it chose us. When you touched me that first night, when you decided to save me instead of running, it snapped into place. I felt it like lightning in my chest." "I don't understand," Marion whispered, even as her heart understood perfectly. You saved my life, Marion Lone Paw. Maxwell reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with reverent care. And in doing so you became mine. My mate. My queen. The other half of my soul. Behind them the hunting horns sounded, closer now. And if they catch us? Marion asked. Maxwell's smile was sharp as a blade. Then they'll learn what it means to threaten a king's mate. The Nightclaw fortress rose from the mountainside like a crown of stone and timber, magnificent and imposing. But as they approached, Marion could see signs of decay. Banners hung torn and neglected. Guards slouched at their posts. The pride that should have radiated from an alpha's seat was conspicuously absent. Silas has let it rot, Maxwell growled. Just like I knew he would. The gates opened before them and wolves poured into the courtyard. Some shifted to human form immediately, their faces shocked and disbelieving. Others remained as wolves, hackles raised, uncertain whether to rejoice or attack. Pai King, an older man breathed, dropping to his knees. We thought you were dead. Silas's mistake. Maxwell's voice carried absolute authority. Where is he? In the Great Hall, my king. But there's something you should know. Your beta Garrett, he refused to accept Silas's claim. Silas has been poisoning him slowly. He's dying. Marion felt Maxwell's rage through the soul thread, but she touched his arm. Take me to him. Now. The pack members stared at her as though she had sprouted wings. A human woman, touching their returned king with casual familiarity, giving orders in their sacred halls. This is Marion Lone Paw, Maxwell announced, his hand covering hers. My mate. My queen. Anyone who questions this answers to me. The silence was deafening. Then a woman shifted forward, her eyes sharp with suspicion. She's human. Fragile. Weak. How can she be queen to wolves? Let me prove myself, Marion said before Maxwell could respond. Take me to Garrett. If I can save him, you'll know I belong here. The woman's laugh was bitter. And if you can't? If our beta dies while you play healer? Then judge me as you will. Marion met her gaze steadily. But let me try. They brought her to a chamber where a massive man lay writhing in fever, his body covered in sweat, his breathing shallow. Marion recognized the symptoms immediately: wolfsbane mixed with silver, a combination designed to kill slowly and painfully. She worked through the night while hostile eyes watched her every move. She had no proper tools, no familiar herbs, only what Maxwell's loyal followers could scavenge. But she had saved one dying wolf already. She could save another. As dawn broke, Garrett's eyes opened, clear and focused for the first time in weeks. Pai King, he rasped, his gaze shifting to Maxwell. You brought a miracle worker. I brought my queen, Maxwell corrected, pride evident in his voice. Outside the chamber, a howl split the morning air. Silas had returned and he was calling for blood. The entire pack gathered in the great hall as Maxwell and Silas faced each other across the stone floor. Silas was younger, well-fed, his body unmarked by Silver's kiss. Maxwell still carried the evidence of betrayal in every scar, but his eyes burned with purpose that made even his enemy hesitate. I should have killed you myself instead of leaving you for the forest to claim, Silas snarled. Your first mistake, Maxwell said quietly. Challenging me now will be your last. They shifted simultaneously, two massive wolves colliding in the center of the hall with bone-shaking force. The pack formed a circle around them, witnessing the ritual combat that would determine their alpha. Marion watched from beside Garrett, her fists clenched, feeling every blow Maxwell took through the soul thread. The fight was brutal and swift. Maxwell was still recovering, but rage and righteous fury gave him strength Silas couldn't match. When Silas realized he was losing, he did what cowards do. He shifted his attention to the one thing that could break his enemy's focus. He lunged for Marion. The pack gasped as Silas charged toward her in wolf form, jaws open, death in his eyes. Marion could have run. Should have run. But she stood her ground, pulling the silver-tipped knife from Garrett's belt, and when Silas leaped, she was ready. The blade caught him across the shoulder, not a killing blow but enough to make him yelp and stumble. In that heartbeat of distraction, Maxwell was on him. The fight ended with Maxwell's jaws locked around Silas's throat, the usurper pinned beneath the true king's weight. Silas shifted back to human form in surrender, and Maxwell released him long enough to speak. You are banished from the northern packs. If you return, you die. Silas fled, broken and defeated, and the hall erupted in howls of celebration. Maxwell shifted back to human form and walked to Marion, blood on his skin, victory in his eyes. "Hi, Pack," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "Witness the soul thread." He took Marion's hand, and the bond between them blazed, visible, golden light that wrapped around them both like living fire. The pack fell silent, awed by the ancient magic they were witnessing. "Marion Lonepaw saved me when I was dying. She defied her own kind to show compassion to an enemy. She stood against a traitor's attack without flinching. She is my mate, my queen, and the bridge between our worlds." Garrett stepped forward, dropping to one knee. "Hail the Wolf Queen." One by one, the entire pack knelt, and Marion understood that her life would never be small again. She had healed a dying wolf, and in return he had made her a queen. And so ends the tale of the human who healed a dying wolf and became the queen of the northern packs. Marion and Maxwell's soul thread proved that compassion can break chains stronger than silver, and that love doesn't recognize the boundaries we try to place around it. But the pack story doesn't end here. My next video is already waiting for you. Another tale of impossible bonds, fierce loyalty, and the magic that happens when two worlds collide. Don't let it slip away into the mist. Click to watch the next story now and continue your journey with me through realms where humans and wolves find that destiny has plans neither expected. Until then, may your path be clear and your heart be brave. The pack awaits your return.